So today we have the pleasure of having with us Helen Froh, who is a professor of philosophy at the University of Stockholm and is also a Wallenberg Academy Fellow. I think that title remains. Now, I'd like to say that by all accounts, Helen needs no introduction, but I'm still going to give her one. And it goes as follows. Most of her research, for those who don't know her, focuses on the ethics of war as well as defensive killing. And I think it's fair to say that she's one of the world's 2 or 3 leading defenders of the so-called revisionists, or as the title of the paper today suggests, reductive individualist theory of just war. In her latest book, entitled Defensive Killing, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2014, and which actually has just been the subject of a major symposium at the Yale Club in New York, she develops a novel account of self-defense and then considers the implication of the account for certain key aspects of killing in war. In particular, the permissibility of intentionally killing non-combatants. Indeed, her work focuses especially on the moral status of non-combatants and the permissibility of killing innocent people in self-defense. As Helen actually herself candidly puts it on her website, she is nothing short of particularly fond of killing the innocent. And that's when I thank the Lord for allowing me to be a sinner when sitting at her side. And I would add that she's the kind of deep and engaged philosopher who pulls no punches and is ready to go to the barricades to vindicate her morbid passion. And this is what some may say make her such an endearingly iconoclastic scholar who inspires, and some might say also compel, respect. Now, Helen is also the author of The Ethics of War and Peace, published with Routledge. She's the co-editor with Gerald Lang of How We Fight Ethics in War. She has published in most normative philosophy journals that you'll be aware of: Ethics, the Proceedings of the Aristotelian Society, the Journal of Moral Philosophy, Oxford Studies in Political Philosophy, and so on and so forth. But I'd like to say that it's really Helen's unparalleled drive that makes her stand tall above the rest of her field. With the Stockholm Center for the Ethics of War and Peace, which she founded and now directs, she's managed to assert herself at a fairly young age as the main driving force, I'd like to say, behind just war theory research, organizing international conference after international conference on all continents. I just had the pleasure of organizing a workshop with her in India earlier this year, and nurturing the world's progeny of just war theorists by convening top graduate students in the field at actually amazing annual retreats focusing on their ongoing research. In some of the world's most exotic locations. In fact, kindly inviting others like me to tag along and comment on their work. Thank you very much, Helen. So I can hardly tell you how pleased I am to welcome Helen to the Nathanson Center, to Osgoode, to York today to present to us her paper on reductive individualism and the just war framework, and more generally as a visiting fellow of the Nathanson Center. So please join me in welcoming Professor Helen Froh.
Thanks, Francois. That was very detailed. Oh.
Yes.
Thanks very much for coming. It's very nice to be here. Very much looking forward to the next couple of weeks hanging out. Right, so the paper is a chapter that's coming out in mine and Seth Lazar's forthcoming handbook on the Oxford Handbook of the Ethics of War. And it's a kind of methodology chapter thinking about some sort of broad theoretical questions in just war theory. So over the past decade or so, just war theory is kind of largely divided into 2 broad theoretical camps. So the first of these camps I'm going to call exceptionalism, which is a term coined by Seth Lazar. And exceptionalism adheres to the kind of historically dominant view of just war, holding that there are at least some respects in which war is morally distinctive. So on this account, there can be justifications for harming that only obtain in war and that wouldn't obtain in what we might think of as ordinary life. Now, this kind of exceptionalism is normally combined with a form of collectivism. So this is the idea that groups can be the proper object of moral evaluation and moral prescription. And typically, when you have something like a state, violence which is undertaken on behalf of that kind of collective can have a different moral status to similar acts of violence that are undertaken by people who aren't sort of representatives of the group. Now, the second main theoretical camp is the reductive individualist view, and reductive individualists reject both of these claims, right? So the exceptionalism and the collectivism. So reductive individualism comprises two strands. The reductivist strand holds that the moral principles that justify harming in war are wholly reducible to the moral principles that justify harming in ordinary life. So on this account, there are no moral principles or justifications of the sort that the exceptionalist believes that obtain only in war. Now, of course, there are factual differences between war and what we might think of as ordinary life. War is usually very complicated. This makes it harder to ascertain certain facts that might be relevant to the morality of harming. And war also involves harming on a really great scale, and often these acts of harming are sort of coordinated through institutions and so on. And that's not typically true of harming in ordinary life. But according to the reductivist, the underlying moral principles don't change as we move from peace to war, nor as we move through the kind of fairly indeterminate phase between the two. Now, the individualist strand of this view holds that individuals are the only proper object of moral evaluation and prescription. So on this view, the fact that an action is undertaken on behalf of a certain group doesn't affect the action's moral status. So you don't get any special permissions to do violence because you represent a collective like a state. And individualists believe that ultimately all the morally relevant values are going to be reducible to their value for individuals. Now, together these claims constitute a pretty radically revisionist account of the ethics of war. And for brevity's sake, I'm going to refer to this just as reductivism. Now, according to this view, war is to be understood in terms of the rights and duties of individuals. Now, I favour this kind of reductivist account, but my aim here is not really to offer a general defence of this view, but rather what I want to do is explore some broad theoretical implications of this account that I think have been largely overlooked by reductivists themselves. So, the central claim of this paper is that we should wholly reject the distinction between jus ad bellum and jus in bello. And these two categories form part of a familiar framework for thinking about the ethics of war. So most of you are probably familiar with these phrases. So jus ad bellum is sort of said to judge the war as a whole in some sense, jus in bello about actions in war. But even though they form part of this very familiar framework for thinking about war, it seems to me that for these categories to be useful, they'd have to differ from each other in at least one of the following ways. So it must be true either that they evaluate different facts, so they're different in terms of their object, their evaluative objects, or that the categories contain different principles, so they're different in terms of their content. Or it could be that they're different in both of these ways. And of course, that's the standard view, is that jus ad bellum is different in terms of its object because it governs the war as a whole, and that it has the following principles as its content. So you need a just cause, last resort, proportionate, a reasonable prospect of success by legitimate means. So that's the kind of standard account of the conditions for jus ad bellum. And then jus in bello, in contrast, is usually said to govern, say, specific offences, so the actions of individual combatants in war. And then the standard account of the content of jus in bello is that combatants can use only discriminative, force that discriminates, and that is necessary for securing a military advantage and proportionate, right? So the collateral harms that they inflict are proportionate to the military good that they secure. So it looks like, on the standard view, these two categories are different both in terms of their objects, what they evaluate, and in terms of their content, so the standards that they're applying to those objects. Okay, so let's start with the content, right? So there's this kind of putative difference in content between jus ad bellum and jus in bello. Now, reductivism is usually characterized, as I just characterized it, as the view that the moral principles that govern harming in war are reducible to the moral principles that govern harming in ordinary life. But of course, this is just one application of a more general reductivist claim, which is that there's just one set of principles that governs the justness of all uses of force, right? And these principles are the same whether we're talking about self-defense or policing or measures short of war, such as drone strikes, or full-scale war. So that's the basic reductivist claim. It's not really a claim about war compared to self-defense. It's just a claim that there's only one set of principles that judges the justness of force. Satisfying these principles is taken to be necessary and sufficient for a use of force as being just. But if this is true, and if jus ad bellum and jus in bello are both supposed to be judging uses of force, it looks like they can't contain different principles by the reductive individualist lights. So if reductivism holds that there's a single set of moral principles for judging the use of force, it follows that a politician's ordering of force at T must satisfy the same criteria as a combatant's using of force at T1. So I suggest that the relevant criteria here are those that are standardly found in the ad bellum conditions. So I think that you have to have a just cause. So there needs to be a just cause. Force must be proportionate. It must be necessary, by which we mean it's the least harmful means of achieving the cause. And it has a reasonable prospect of success by legitimate means. So I think that these are the principles that tell us whether or not somebody's allowed to use force. Now, given that these are the principles that are usually found in accounts of jus ad bellum, we need to see why they're also the principles that apply to the specific offences within war that are usually thought to be the remit of jus in bello. So I think the conditions of proportionality and necessity, or least harmful means as I'm calling it, clearly have counterparts in jus in bello. That's pretty explicit. So I perhaps don't need to say too much about the idea that these have counterparts in jus in bello. But I think it's also now fairly widely accepted that having a just cause is relevant to the justness of an individual combatant's action. So as Jeff McMahon and Thomas Herker have argued, having a just cause is relevant to the justness of a combatant's actions because it's a prerequisite of satisfying proportionality. So proportionality weights morally relevant harms against morally relevant goods. But if you're fighting on the unjust side of a war, you don't have any goods that you can weigh against the harms you're inflicting, right? Because it's not morally good if you manage to achieve a military advantage. That's bad because you're fighting on the unjust side. So as McMahon and Herker have argued, it looks like it's only if you've got a just cause, only if you've got some moral goods that you're pursuing, that you're going to ever be able to cause proportionate collateral harm. If you're on the unjust side, all of the harm that you cause is just going to be disproportionate. And I think we can run a similar argument with respect to necessity. So the fact that force is the least harmful means of achieving an end can form part of a justification only if the end's morally good, right? So it may be true that the only way in which I can steal your wallet is by killing you, but this doesn't give me a kind of partial justification for killing you. It doesn't somehow make it a bit better if I kill you. So when the end's morally wrong, there's just no role for necessity to play. Now, given this, it looks like then there has to be a just cause for each individual harmful action if it's going to have any chance of satisfying necessity and proportionality. Now, notice that this doesn't mean that the only admissible just cause for war is going to be the initial just cause that gave rise to the war in the first place. So Saba Bazargan's pointed out that there could be other just causes for using force that arise during the course of a conflict. So there might be cases, for example, in which combatants whose country is fighting an unjust war come across, say, civilians being subjected to punitive attacks, right? And we might think that the combatants, even though their country is fighting an unjust war, are allowed to engage in defensive actions in order to defend their civilians from being harmed. So a combatant could have a just cause for some of her actions and lack a just cause for others. And even those writers who've recently tried to defend the idea that state combatants enjoy special permissions to do violence don't typically claim that this puts them on a moral par with combatants on the just side of the war. So the concern of these writers has really been to show, look, combatants who fight on the unjust side of a war as part of a state armed force are not like ordinary killers in ordinary life, but they're not really trying to show that people who fight for the state on the unjust side of the war are the moral equals of those people who fight for a state with a just cause. So what about discrimination? So this is kind of a putative in bello requirement, but I think it's also found in the ad bellum condition that war must have a reasonable prospect of success by legitimate means. And people often forget that last little end bit when they think about reasonable prospect of success. But it's clearly important, right? Because impermissible means of fighting, which includes means that fail to discriminate between legitimate and illegitimate targets or that inflict unnecessary suffering, don't count for the purposes of having a reasonable prospect of success. So the fact that one could, for example, use biological weapons to secure one's just cause wouldn't count as helping to satisfy the success condition because it would be impermissible to use them even if you had to, Right? So once we spell out the success condition in this way, which is kind of the only plausible way to understand it, the requirement to discriminate, we can see, is found in jus ad bellum, just as it's found in jus in bello. Now, whilst the success condition is usually included only as a condition of jus ad bellum, specific offences within war also have to have a reasonable prospect of success. So I've argued elsewhere that the success condition is motivated by concerns about collateral harm. So it's wrong to use force against even a culpable, liable attacker if one has little prospect of averting the threat that she poses and one's risking harm to innocent bystanders, right? Collateral harms. So given this, combatants also have to think about how likely their actions are to succeed in any case in which they're going to be causing collateral harm to civilians, right? So they're standardly the innocent bystanders in war. So I think the claim that there's a single set of conditions for the just use of force is a deeper and more general truth that underlies various reductivist arguments. So, for example, Michael Walzer and Jeff McMahon have had a famous debate over the last few years about what we call the moral equality of combatants. And this is framed as a disagreement about the relationship between jus ad bellum and jus in bello. So Walzer believes that these two are morally independent, such that a combatant can satisfy the in bello conditions, she can fight well, even if her state lacks a just cause, right? Even if it fails jus ad bellum. McMahon, in contrast, has argued that satisfying jus ad bellum, right, having the just cause, is a necessary condition of being able to fight well, to satisfy the in bello conditions. But if, as I'm suggesting, the reductivist account of war can't sustain a difference between these two categories, then this way of framing the debate's confused. So McMahon would clearly be right that combatants can't satisfy jus in bello whilst violating jus ad bellum. But this is because they're the same conditions. It's not because there's some kind of moral dependence between the two sets of conditions. Now, some just war theorists have agreed that jus ad bellum and jus in bello consist in the same principles, but they argue that the categories are nonetheless useful because there's some difference in their evaluative objects. So Cecile Fabre, for example, suggests that the terms are merely a convenient way to demarcate various phases in the initiation, conduct, and termination of a war. So she's sort of granting, look, we're just using the same standards, but we're applying them to different things when we talk about ad bellum versus in bello. So they're still useful. But it seems to me that this is a mistake. So making ad bellum judgments is typically thought to involve something like judging the war as a whole in some way. That's normally what people mean when they talk about ad bellum. But if we claim to be judging the war as a whole, by which we normally mean one side of a conflict, right, the Allied war against Germany, for example, we need to know precisely what constitutes the war as a whole, what it is that we're evaluating. Now, I'm going to set aside here kind of historical analyses of past wars and focus on ad bellum judgments that we're making with respect to prospective wars, so wars that we might fight, and with wars that are ongoing, that we're currently fighting. Now, I suggest that the most plausible interpretation of an ad bellum judgment is that it's a prediction about how the war will be fought. That is, about the individual actions that will make up the war, or in the case of ongoing wars, the remainder of the war. Now, if so, it looks like the distinction between the objects of jus ad bellum and jus in bello collapses, because both are judging individual actions. And of course, this seems to be the right kind of result for a reductive individualist, given the claim that individuals are the proper object of moral evaluation and prescription. Now, defenders of the distinction will likely respond that jus ad bellum offers a kind of summative verdict of all of the combatants' individual actions sort of taken together. So it judges the war as a whole by somehow combining all of those individual actions into a single assessment that tells us whether fighting the war as a whole is just or unjust. Now, in contrast, we might say jus in bello just judges only an individual combatant's actions, or just perhaps a very small subset of individual combatants' actions, maybe tied to one specific offensive. But then we need to know what it means to combine individual actions in this way. So given that any plausible assessment of a war will include a prediction that it's going to contain some wrongdoing, right? Every war predictably includes some acts of wrongdoing. We need to think carefully about the kinds of normative conclusions that we draw from the claim that a war is overall justified. So it wouldn't follow, for example, from the fact that combatants on, say, an overall justified side fight justly, because some of them will fight unjustly. We know this. We know that some people who are on the unjust side of the war are going to engage in war crimes, for example. Right? Some of them are going to violate the principles that govern the use of force. And we can't conclude either that combatants who fight on the overall unjustified side are going to fight unjustly, because they could have just causes for specific actions of the sort that Saba Bazargan's identified, of defending their civilians against unjust attacks and so on. So it seems to me that the best guidance that we can get from such a judgment is that some of the actions of the individual. So I think when we say that a war is overall justified, what we're saying is that the individual actions of the war may be performed despite recognizing that if the war is fought, then some wrongdoing will take place. I think that's what we mean when we say that a war is overall justified. Now, of course, this is still a judgment about individual actions. So we're comparing the number of predicted just actions to the number of predicted unjust actions. And we're sort of comparing to see whether or not there's enough just actions to warrant the foreseen unjust actions. But it might seem that this is nonetheless still enough to support a distinction between ad bellum and in bello, because making this judgment still involves considering sort of all of the individual actions of the war within a given period, right, telling us whether the war may continue to be fought or be fought. But this would support the distinction between jus ad bellum and jus in bello, only if this is not also what determines whether an individual combatant is justified in using force. And it seems to me that, in fact, this is precisely what determines whether an individual combatant is justified in using force. So at this point, it might be helpful to distinguish between fact-relative justifications for acting and evidence-relative justifications for acting. So an agent's fact-relative justified in acting if the moral facts give her sufficient reason to act. Now, in contrast, an agent's evidence-relative justified in acting if, were her evidence concerning the facts accurate, she would have sufficient reason to act. Now, we can illustrate this distinction with, I've got some pictures for you now, Francois, with two trolley problems. So in the first case, trolley, we've got bystander at the switch. So we've got the trolley, it's heading towards 100 people. I couldn't draw all of them because that would take a really long time, and they'd have to be really small. So the trolley is heading towards 100 people. It's going to kill them all unless it's diverted down the sidetrack. Bystander can divert the trolley down the sidetrack where it will kill one innocent person. And then in the loop case, the trolley is again heading towards 100 people. Bystander sees that she can divert the trolley down the sidetrack where it's going to kill a single person. However, what she can't see is that the trolley then loops back round and it's going to kill the 100 anyway. Now, in trolley, bystander's fact-relative justified in diverting the trolley. So given that she can save 100 lives and she'll kill only one person as a side effect, the facts give her sufficient reason to divert. But in the loop case, bystander's fact-relative unjustified in diverting the trolley. So if she diverts the trolley in this case, she'll needlessly kill one person and the 100 are still going to die. So by the light of the facts, she shouldn't divert the trolley. However, bystander's evidence relative justified in diverting the trolley in the loop case because her evidence is that diverting will save 100 lives at the cost of killing one as a side effect. So if her evidence accurately reflected the facts, she'd be fact relative justified in diverting. Now, much of the reductivist literature adopts the fact-relative perspective when assessing the justness of an agent's action. So Jeff McMahon in particular holds that an agent is justified in causing harm only if she's fact-relative justified. Now, those who act on the basis of evidence that doesn't reflect the facts might be excused for so acting, but they're not on a moral par with those who are fact-relative justified. But on the fact-relative perspective, the range of facts relevant to a combatant's actions is not limited to those facts of which she's aware. So on the contrary, the fact-relative justification of her action will depend on all of the facts that could be morally relevant to her action. Right? So facts that if she knew them, she ought to factor them into her deliberations about what to do. So on this view, even if a combatant doesn't know what the other members of her country's armed forces are doing, the fact that she might be facilitating their wrongdoing or that her own actions might depend upon or incentivize wrongdoing will partly determine whether or not she's justified in using force. So from the fact-relative perspective then, there's no difference in the objects of jus ad bellum compared to jus in bello. Now we might reply all the worse to the fact-relative perspective, right? And this move is open to reductive individualists as well as their critics. So there's nothing about reductive individualism that commits its proponents to a fact-relative account of justification. But it's not clear that the evidence-relative account of justification is going to do any better at sustaining a distinction between the objects of jus ad bellum and jus in bello. So say that we adopt an evidence-based account of justification. This might mean that in some cases an agent is justified in acting even though her action is unjust from a fact-relative perspective. But this would support the ad bellum in bello distinction only if there were some forms of evidence that might be relevant to an ad bellum judgment, but irrelevant to a combatant's in bello assessment. But I doubt that this is correct. So of course, as a purely contingent matter, those people who make decisions about the war as a whole, so sort of a high-ranking combatant or politicians, will likely have more evidence available to them, or more specifically, evidence about more people's actions available to them than your average combatant on the ground. But that doesn't mean that they have, in principle, different objects of assessment in a way that supports a distinction between jus ad bellum and jus in bello. There's no evidence that might be relevant to a commander's deliberation about whether to use force that should be discarded or ignored by a lower-ranking combatant. So therefore, neither a fact-relative account nor an evidence-relative account of justification vindicates the claim that jus ad bellum and jus in bello have different objects of assessment. So if I'm right that reductive individualism can't sustain the ad bellum and in bello distinction, some people will think that this is a reason to reject the reductive individualist view. So Seth Lazar has argued that the individualist view seemingly precludes identifying the sides of a war because there's no obvious way in which an individualist can kind of unify the actions of one set of combatants into a coherent whole. And if this is right, he says, reductivism can't play the important role of enabling us to make judgments about the war, and yet, he argues, such evaluation is both widespread and necessary. Now, moreover, he says, if we adopt the sort of individualism that I'm proposing, it no longer makes any sense to ask whether a war was justified. Rather, we can only ask about the justification of individual actions that make up the war, and then we can offer the thought that, well, the war is justified only if each of those individual actions is justified. And he says this is just going to set the bar for justified war really very high. He says it's going to make justified wars practically impossible. Now, I think Lazar's right that we're used to this kind of talk of just and unjust wars, right? So we do engage in evaluations of the sort that he describes. But such talk is often met with skepticism, right? Commonly expressed by the retort that there's no such thing as a just war. This is a common reply when we talk about, when I tell someone I work on just war theory, they'll say, there's no such thing as a just war. So even if we adopt the more measured description of justified war, which better captures this sense that lots of the harms of war befall innocent people who are not liable to any harm, offering this kind of single evaluation of such myriad actions strikes many people as somehow morally inappropriate. And such reactions are unsurprising. So wars that we typically describe as just, such as the Allies' war against Nazi Germany, contain many instances of wrongdoing that range from kind of mildly disproportionate or overly risky offences to just kind of appalling atrocities. So no wonder then that people balk at the idea that we might just give a sweeping evaluation that gives us an overall assessment of the war as a whole. Moreover, the natural response to this kind of skepticism is to disaggregate the actions of the war, to grant that, of course, some of the offensives were wrong and that some atrocities were committed and that these actions were unjust, but that others were justified in light of the importance of securing the just cause. So if we're looking to reflect how people actually judge war, there's no reason to think that a collectivist evaluation of war as a whole better serves this purpose than a more nuanced individualist account. Now, despite his emphasis on distinguishing the war as a whole from what he calls its constituent actions and operations, so by which I take it he means the kind of individual actions of combatants, Lazar doesn't elaborate on what it means to evaluate the war as a whole as distinct from these constituent actions and operations. So the distinction that he's proposing seems to be grounded in thoughts about what people can control. So political and military leaders can control whether the war is fought, for example, whereas individual combatants can control only their own actions and the actions of some of their subordinates. But the sphere of what I can control doesn't exhaust the sphere of what's morally relevant to my actions. So on the contrary, war is just a particularly complex example of how the justness of what we do can depend on the actions of others. And I think that understanding this kind of interaction helps us to resolve Lazar's worry that individualism sets the bar for justified war too high. So my claim is not that war is justified only if every individual action of the war is justified. My claim is that one can sometimes be justified in acting, even if one foresees that others will then engage in wrongdoing as a consequence. So we can take a case like prediction. So in this case, we have a runaway trolley again. It's heading to where it's going to kill 100 people. A bystander can divert the trolley to where it's going to break workmen's legs. But she knows if she does this, she knows Workman, she knows he's a bit of a jerk. So she knows that if she diverts it towards him, he's going to divert it down this track. Like that. And it's going to kill Jogger, who's an innocent person. He's going to kill her in order to spare himself the cost of 2 broken legs. Now, I think bystanders justified in diverting the trolley, despite knowing that if she does so, Workman will then engage in the wrongful killing of an innocent person. Now, 2 points arise from this case. The first is that one may be justified in acting, even foreseeing that others will then engage in wrongdoing. The second is that there seems to be little point in asking whether bystander and Workman's actions taken together were justified or unjustified. Right, so whether the actions of the case were justified as a whole. So we can ask whether bystander is justified in acting despite knowing what Workman will do, and we can ask whether Workman's justified in acting despite knowing that he'll kill an innocent person. But there's nothing useful about trying to come up with an overall assessment of their 2 actions considered as a whole. My suggestion is that there's similarly nothing useful about trying to come up with some overall assessment of the actions of a war. Now, of course, we might say, look, bystander and Workman aren't acting together, whereas combatants who are part of a war are part of a kind of joint project in the sense that, at least for the most part, they're trying to achieve the same goal and they're collaborating to that end. So we can take a case like Cure. This one's a bit complicated. All right, so this is Alice. She's dying of a terrible illness. Now, Brian and Christian. All right, change it. So Brian and Christian know that they need 100 leaves from a rare plant in order to cure her, and they agree to find 50 leaves each. Now, Brian plans to obtain his 50 leaves by stealing them from people who would otherwise only use them to treat minor ailments. That's how he's going to get his 50. Now, Christian, who's Alice's husband, intends to get his 50 leaves by just killing a bunch of people who own the plants. Now, and that's how he's going to get his 50. Now, once the plants are dug up, they lose their powers in a short period of time, so if they're not used to cure Alice, they'll be useless. Now, Brian and Christian have a joint project here of saving Alice. Now, assume that Brian's stealing the leaves from the people who'd only use them to treat minor ailments is justified if this is necessary for saving Alice's life. But let's just also assume that Christian's killing all of these people to get their plants is unjustified, even if it's necessary for saving Alice's life. Now, we can imagine several variations of this case. So, for example, we might suppose that Christian will engage in his unjustified actions only if Brian also acts. So if Brian refuses to steal the 50 leaves, Christian's going to conclude there's no point in killing these people to get his 50 leaves, because the 50 leaves that he will gather is insufficient to save Alice's life. So in this version of the case, Brian clearly ought not to act, because he'll thereby prevent the unjust killings of all these people. Now, since partial completion of the plan won't achieve sufficient good to warrant the infringements that Brian would impose, right? So Alice needs all 100 leaves to survive, and the plants can't be used for any other good end. Stealing the plants is unjustified. And this would be true even if there are other justified ways in which Christian could get his share of the plants, but Brian predicts that he won't use those legitimate means. Now, one way to understand this argument is as a claim that Brian lacks a reasonable prospect of securing his just cause by legitimate means. So even though it seems as if Brian can kind of carry out his mission, right, his part of the joint project without violating anyone's rights, the success of his mission is determined not by whether he steals the plants, but whether he saves Alice's life. And there's no prospect that Alice's life will be saved by legitimate means if her being saved depends upon Christians engaging in all these unjustified killings. So the success of Brian's plan thus depends upon illegitimate means. But things seem different when the wrongful actions are not under Brian's control or they've already occurred. So it's not that the actions are then irrelevant to Brian's reasoning. So on the contrary, it could be that Brian's actions are justified only because Christian will inevitably act or has already acted, albeit wrongly. So imagine that Brian has no way of communicating to Christian that he's not going to steal his share of the plants and he doesn't want any part of this plan. If Brian knows that Christian's going to engage in the wrongful killings, it seems as if Brian ought to act and steal his share precisely because he knows that Christian will act. Now, this isn't an argument that Brian can sort of partially redeem the harms that Christian inflicts by making sure that at least some good results from the killings. It rather seems like Brian ought to regard those harms as a kind of sunk cost. Right? Since the owners are now going to be killed no matter what Brian does, he at least now has an opportunity to save Alice's life that doesn't involve inflicting any additional unjustified harms. But again, it strikes me as confused and unhelpful to ask whether Brian and Christian's actions taken together are justified or unjustified. And that question doesn't get any more sensible if we start increasing the number of actors involved. So when Brian can prevent Christian's wrongdoing by refraining from acting, his acting would be unjustified, and Christian's acting would also be unjustified. But when Brian has no control over the fact that Christian acts, we can describe Christian's action as unjustified and Brian's action as justified. And it seems to me that this is how a reductive individualist should think about war, not by trying to combine actions together to offer a single evaluation of war as a whole, but in terms of the justification of individual actions. But if so, there's just no role for the ad bellum and in bello distinction to play in our account of the ethics of war. So, reductive individualists have challenged various specific aspects of traditional accounts of the ethics of war. But I think insufficient attention's really been paid to the broad conceptual commitments of this view. So in this paper, I've argued that reductivism, being a claim that there's a single set of principles that governs all uses of force, commits its proponents to denying any difference in content between the categories of jus ad bellum and jus in bello. And furthermore, individualism, understood as the claim that individuals are the object of moral evaluation and prescription, commits its proponents to the claim that there's no difference in object between jus ad bellum and jus in bello. Now, I've argued that it's false that jus ad bellum can be sensibly understood as evaluating the war as a whole. There's no meaningful evaluation to be made about whether the set of individual actions that compose one side of the conflict are overall justified. Rather, we can only meaningfully evaluate individual actions. However, the justness of these actions will often depend in intricate ways on the actions of others. So I think developing a robust reductive individualist account of the ethics of war requires investigating this kind of interdependence in considerable depth. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen. Now, I know some people had to leave earlier, so I'd like to focus on their questions first before moving on to those of others. Professor Giudice, there's a microphone that's going around, please. Make use of it. Jericho, please circulate it down, yes. And there's another one on the other side.
So thanks very much, Helen. Great use of PowerPoint pictures, which are often sorely missing in sort of, applied moral theory. I didn't so much, I don't know if it's an objection yet, but I wonder if you could comment on what one might see as a consequence of your challenging the distinction between jus ad bello and jus in bello. So I'm just curious about what your thoughts on whether there might be a kind of conceptual revision that might be downstream somewhere. So one of the concepts that jus ad bello, the distinction between jus ad bello and jus in bello sustains is the very concept of war. Right? So it makes a difference whether a state declares, I'm no expert on the laws of war, so I should say straight away, but it makes a difference whether a state declares they're going to war, when a war is over, and so on. So there are various implications for that state of being in a war, making that declaration. But it seems to me that if you challenge that distinction the way that you've done, there might be a case for thinking that the concept of war starts to lose its utility. It starts to become a concept which might be misleading us politically and morally, but even just misleading us about the nature of armed action. So I'm just wondering, just curious, I don't know if there's an objection there, but just curious about whether you might see any implications or consequences for the very concept of war, which might sort of fall out of the revisionist project in just war theory.
Thanks. So on the revisionist sort of reductive individualist view, the concept of war is just not important. It's not morally significant. So nothing follows from the fact that you're at war in terms of morally what you can do. So there's no kind of step change as you move from sort of self-defense to larger numbers of people engaging in violence to civil war. So there's no kind of point at which we say, okay, look, now it's war, so things are different. So I take the point, it's certainly true that when a state declares war, the laws governing the behavior of its agents then change, right? Because now the behavior of its agents is governed under the laws of armed conflict. But of course, like the main thrust of that is, well, one of the most important is things like it now affords combatant privilege, right? So it allows their soldiers to kill people with impunity, basically. As long as they're killing combatants and they're adhering to the in bello rules, they face no legal consequences for killing. But the whole sort of thrust, one of the central tenets of reductivism is that actually that's morally mistaken, because there's massive asymmetry between combatants who fight on the just side and on the unjust side. So it's true that on this view, nothing does kind of jettison the idea of war as a morally significant category where things are changing because now we're at war. But I don't take that to be an objection. That's the view, kind of, right? That's the position, that the mere fact of being at war just makes no moral difference.
Yeah, Professor McLaughlin, if you can just pass down the microphone, please.
I'm not sure that this is an objection either. It's just a question. So I'm thinking about the reductivist individualist claim that there's sort of no distinction between war and non-war. I'm actually thinking about what that means for non-war. So presumably it means that the sort of principles of just war have to be applied outside, or insofar as they're defensible in war, they're defensible outside of war, at least in some degrees. Now, I'm not so familiar with just war theory, but I do work quite a bit on questions of oppression and resistance, and particularly justification for resistance to oppression. And one of the sort of agreed upon moves that's been made in the literature lately, sort of coming from Bernard Boxall and others, is that it's a moral failure to fail to resist oppression, even when there is no chance of that resistance having success. So even if you know that your act of resistance won't change your oppression, you are morally obligated to resist. And there's often sort of a Kantian justification for this in terms of self-respect. And Carol Hay has developed this in sort of more detail in her recent book on oppression. But I was thinking, insofar as sometimes resistance to oppression can not necessarily, it doesn't have to be violent, but even non-violent resistance to oppression can cause harm, ranging from inconveniences to damage to property to sort of protest, interrupting people, whatever. Does it fall short of the, I'm trying to find the reasonable prospect of success by legitimate means? I mean, I wonder if this has implications for non-wartime context that could be a bit worrying for those of us who are sort of invested in the idea of resistance as a moral act.
So I think it is impermissible. Thanks for the question. I think it's interesting, but I think it is impermissible to engage in resistance if you thereby endanger the lives of people who are not already in danger, right? So if there's somebody who will otherwise survive, say, but I'm going to engage in an act of resistance that endangers this person's life, and the act of my resistance is utterly futile, right? There's no way I'm going to get what I want, so it lacks any prospect of success. I'm just gratuitously endangering the life of an innocent person. So it seems to me weird to think that I'd be morally obliged to gratuitously endanger the lives of innocent people.
Right. Can I just ask a quick follow-up? So does this principle only apply to harm to the extent of endangerment, or would it apply to lesser harms?
So I'm focusing on the use of force. So I should clarify. So in my view, there's no such thing really as principles of just war. There's only principles for the use of force. Right. So I think there could be interesting things to say about non-forceful resistance, maybe.
But I could use force and not endanger someone's life. I could just use force and hold up their
Right. So this is why I think it matters, right? So I think it matters. So the classic case that people often point to is something like, say, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, right? So, but what's kind of really important about that case is the thought that, well, these people were kind of dead anyway, right? So there was nobody they were endangering who was otherwise going to survive. The only people they were trying to harm were, let's say, liable Nazi combatants, and anybody who was in the crossfire would have anyway have been killed by the Nazis. So if you have a case like that in which there's nobody who would otherwise survive, it might be that there's something kind of morally dignified or honorable about killing some of these people who are liable to be killed. We might think also deserve to be killed, maybe. And also this eliminates their capacity to pose threats to other people, right? So it might be futile in terms of your defense, but it could, undermines their clear. If you kill them, they can't kill anybody else, even if it doesn't ultimately save your life.
Sorry, just to clarify, and this is a stupid question because I don't work in just war theory. This only applies to force to the extent of life endangerment. It doesn't apply to lesser degrees.
Oh no! Oh, sorry. Yeah, sure. No. So if I'm maybe completely trivial harms, but imagine that I'm trying to defend myself, defend my life, and the only way in which I can.
I just want to move away from life and death. Okay, you're trying to defend your life.
So whatever, right? So say that Francois is trying to break my leg, right? And I have no prospect of stopping him from breaking my leg, but I can still throw a grenade at him, which won't stop him from breaking my leg, but it's going to really cause you, say, moderate burns to your face, right? Now, it seems to me that if there's no chance that I'm going to stop him from breaking my leg, all I'm doing is just gratuitously burning your face. And it would be really weird to think that I was morally obliged to gratuitously burn someone's face.
Okay, but suppose you're a Black Lives Matter protester and you have no chance of radically changing the racist US state. But many people would say you still have an obligation to resist the racist supremacy. But there's a chance that you're going to seriously cause harm to people by endangering their property, by disrupting their days, by giving them a sense of fear, by sort of threatening their sort of workday life. You would have to say that that would only be justified if you felt you really could change the system. And if you weren't reasonably sure you could change the system, you wouldn't. Because I just feel like once we get away from burns and leg breaking, it starts to lose its plausibility once you're out of the life and death situations. I mean, I think sometimes there's a nobility in resistance, even if it causes unjustified harm to others, or it causes harm to innocent third parties.
So I think we probably do disagree then, right? So I think one thing to think about is what counts as a reasonable prospect of success might not be fixed. So it could be that what I'm trying to resist is the massively unjust system of racism in the US, for example. It could be that actually I just need some, right? What counts as reasonable could be just a slight prospect. If it's a small prospect of averting this massively unjust system, right, of dismantling that, it could be that just a small chance that's going to benefit many, many people is a reasonable prospect of success that could justify some foreseen collateral harms. But if there's no, I think in the Black Lives Matter campaign, right, I don't think people think, look, it's just impossible that there could ever be racial equality in the US, right? They think it's going to be really difficult, but those are radically different things, right? Very difficult to just impossible, right? Because in the former case, you're not just gratuitously endangering people's lives, but in the case in which there's no prospect of success, then yeah, I do think it would be impermissible.
But that's a heavy understanding of reasonable prospect of success. I mean, that's a very particular understanding of reasonable prospect of success. That sounds like faint hope or politically idealistic view of the future.
So I think it's fairly standard to think that what's reasonable can depend on what the stakes are, right? So I'm just suggesting that in cases in which the stakes are very high, I might be able to act in a way that I foresee will cause harm, even if there's just a small prospect of success. But if the stakes were low, right, if all I'm doing is averting some minor harm to myself, it looks like it seems normal that then the ratio between kind of the just cause that I'm trying to secure and how much prospect of success I need is likely to change, right? Because it'd have to be pretty important what I'm trying to get to in order to justify inflicting harms on people. Yeah.
Professor Priya.
First, thanks for a very short and interesting paper. I'm a complete outsider to the field, so it was also a good introduction to me about, now I could, I guess, talk on dinner parties about the exceptionalist versus reductivist.
It's always a winner.
Yes, exactly. At least among philosophers, I suppose. But in a way, I want to kind of continue on Mike's question and maybe be a bit more on the attack in the sense that so someone might say or present your argument as a sort of reductio against your view, because they might say, you're not describing war, you're describing a large brawl, basically. And one aspect of war is that it's not just attack on a large number of individuals. It's an attack on at least traditionally, maybe now the shape of the form of war is changing, but it's a war traditionally, at least, is understood as a fight between states. And it's not just war that may disappear from your story, it's also the concept of, or the idea that states are involved in war. And beyond this, here's a question, again, as an outsider. So perhaps the debate here is really not, so it's perhaps only a manifestation of much bigger debate, one that I actually take an interest in. So that's where I kind of come or see this debate between these two groups, between those who basically think that political philosophy is a lot of moral philosophy. So there's no
distinct idea of political philosophy. All of moral philosophy can be reduced to moral philosophy, the relationship between individuals, interactions between individuals. And you just multiply it by a million, and then you get political philosophy. Against a different school of thought that thinks that political philosophy is largely distinct. It's not completely separate from, but largely distinct from moral philosophy. If you want kind of the names of the people on both sides, so the first view is, for example, is Nozick, who reduces his political philosophy of distributive justice to, the relationships between individuals, and on the other side you have Rawls, whose political philosophy is not reducible to the relationships between individuals. And what we are seeing, so that's a debate there in the domain of distributive justice, and that's just another, and your debate is just another, sorry, exactly when I'm asking the question. I got the phone call. And yours, this debate you're talking about is just another incarnation or manifestation of that big debate. So that's in a way a question, not a challenge.
Thanks, Annie. So yeah, I guess so it's true that on my view, it doesn't matter whether we're talking. I'm never really entirely clear what people mean by a brawl, but this is a claim about the circumstances under which you can use force. And the thought is that states don't get any special permissions to use force that their individual members wouldn't enjoy. And I think, it's certainly true that the traditional model of just war theory has been very state-based, right? But it's also that it kind of falls short in various respects, right? So civil war, of course, is a common phenomenon which isn't between states. If you think about, say, the conflict between Al-Qaeda and the United States, right, you're not going to fit this into the state paradigm, right? So if we want to have principles for governing the use of force, which can tell us something about those conflicts, right, which don't obviously fit into domestic criminal law, they don't fit into, right, sort of the state-based paradigm of just war theory, well, it looks like a view that just focuses on uses of force instead of sort of privileging war between states, right? If we understand war as a conflict between states, it's going to just be much more useful and much more practical, actually. And also just much more consistent, right? Because it's hard to see why we would say, look, if you're fighting in a civil war, you can do X, Y, and Z, right? But if it's a war between states, well, now you can do all these other things as well because you're a state, right? You can kill people that those people can't kill. So in that way, I find that's why I'm a reductivist, right? Because I find it much more useful and plausible to think that there is no step change as you sort of shift up to the state level. There's simply moral principles that govern the use of force, and these just remain fixed across all of these contexts. So I think it's more useful to think about conflict rather than war, because I think that's what we're really interested in these days. Is state-on-state conflict sort of comparatively rare compared to civil conflicts. So on the sort of the broader question about sort of the political philosophy, yeah, so I guess I'm on the Nozickian side, right? I understand political philosophy as being reducible to the rights and duties of individuals, yeah. So I don't think that sort of, I work on the war stuff, right? So maybe there's going to be some other areas of political life where I think, okay, yeah, maybe, the institutions or whatever, it's gonna make some difference. But I think ultimately I'm going to say, look, these still have to be, these say special privileges that you want to grant. So I still wouldn't think that you could have special privileges for harming, right? But there could be for say, how we distribute benefits, for example. Maybe we think about that those are different in institutions. Still, I think that ultimately this should probably be able to be justified in terms of individual rights and duties, yeah.
Professor Ignatsky.
Thanks, Helen. So there are two types of reductivism going on, and I think I agree with one of them, and not so sure that I agree with the other one. Then I just wondered if you think that they come apart. And so this resisting this distinction between ad bellum and in bello, and sort of deflating all that down to one set of principles that applies to justifying the use of force. I think I agree with that, and I quite like that part. But then I wondered if you could buy into that, but then not buy into the reductive individualism bit as well. And so you said throughout the paper, then at the end you said you could only meaningfully evaluate individual actions. And I thought about that, and I think that sometimes it is morally meaningful to consider what groups of people do together, and it's also morally meaningful for evaluating then individual participants within those groups, their actions as well. And so I was thinking about genocide as an example. It's really hard to get to call something a genocide unless you're seeing people working together to target a group of people. Otherwise, you're just talking about individuals murdering. And there seems to be something morally significant to getting that collective aspect. And that then reduces down to how we would evaluate what the individual does. The individual commits a murder and also contributes to a genocide. So anyway, I guess I'm asking you about if those two things come apart. So you could be a reductivist in terms of the principles, but then also a collectivist in some respects.
Thanks. That's interesting. So I think probably you could be. So then there's a question of whether we should be. So I think you could be a reductivist in terms of, say, the content, right, of that, thinking there's just one set of principles. But then it seems like you want to say, I don't want to be a reductivist in terms of the object. So I think that it's not the case that we can only make individuals the proper object of moral evaluation because there's going to be groups, right? Right. So I think that's kind of the standard view that so some reductivists who've thought about this, like Cecile Fabre and Seth Lazar, have kind of made that move where they say, look, these categories are the same in terms of their content, but they've got different objects. It's a bit funny for Fabre to do this because she's also a sort of like a cosmopolitan individualist. So it's a bit odd that she's taken this view, and I think she's kind of maybe retracting it a little bit now. But on the on the question of say something like the genocide case, so. For me, I'd want to say, look, it's part of what you do as an individual that you contribute to a genocide. So I think it's true that what I do can kind of alter in light of how my actions combine with others. It's just that I don't think that there's some kind of like what's sometimes called like the responsibility gap or the moral remainder. All right. So if we think about something like, say, the oil spill in the Gulf, right, and some people want to say, look, it's important that we're able to hold a collective accountable for this great harm, because no individual member of the group sort of did anything that was all that bad, right? So we can imagine there's just like someone forgets to do a safety check, someone forgets to tighten a screw, someone doesn't sign off on signing of the screw, right? So we can just imagine that the individuals only do something little, and it seems somehow inappropriate to hold them, anybody, or even all of them, sort of responsible for this enormous harm that resulted from all of these little actions, right? So we could imagine a case like that in which people say, look, in this case, it seems like we have to hold the group, the company responsible in a way that like somehow is sort of seems proportionate to the amount of harm that's caused. Because otherwise we get this kind of gap, right? Because no individual looks sufficiently responsible to be blamed for, say, the oil spill in the Gulf. But that just seems to me like a wrong kind of way of thinking about these things. So I think it can just be the case that, so I don't think that there's moral responsibility left over once we've decided what each individual is responsible for, I guess is the short version. So I think once we've said this person did X, this person did Y, this person did Z, we've told the whole story about who's responsible for the harm. So even though I agree with you that we can say things like, look, you've contributed to a genocide, I want to say, yeah, and that's something that you did as an individual. So what your actions are still, they can be, what you contribute to can depend on what other people are doing. But it's still, there's no moral remainder that sort of we can attribute to the group, right? So it's not like we could say, look, the group committed genocide, but this individual just committed murder, right? I want to say, no, each individual committed genocide and murder, right? Because what they contributed to was a genocide as an individual. Does that make sense?
It does. I guess my question was how you would make the move to determining that each individual contributed to the genocide if you didn't sort of conceptually first realize that together this is what they did.
So it's fine to think that. So I think if you're a reductive individualist, you can think that the actions of others can determine what it is that you're doing, right? So if each of us just gives Francois a kick and he dies for being kicked to death, but we only each kick him once, then what I've done is I've helped to murder Francois. I haven't just given him a kick, I've helped to murder him. But that's how I helped to murder him, was by giving him a kick. So I'm totally on board with things like that, right? I think this is one of the interesting ways in which civilian liability in war gets off the ground is that it doesn't matter if you just contribute a small amount if because what matters in part for proportionality is what you're contributing to. That's what makes it proportionate for Francois to use lethal defense against me, right? It's because I'm helping to kill him. If all I was doing was just giving him a kick, right, he wouldn't be able to lethally defend himself against me because it would be disproportionate. So the reductivist view is consistent with that, right? That's my view, right? What I don't want to say is something like, there's a group that murdered Francois, but no individual murdered Francois, right? But that's kind of a bit like what the collectivist view ends up saying, that there's something like, look, there's a state that acted wrongly and engaged in an unjust war, but no individual combatant, as long as they followed the Imbella rules, there were no unjust killings. I mean, that could be a coherent view on the collectivist account, is that the state engaged in an unjust war, but that there were no unjust killings. And that seems to me really confused.
Okay, so Professor Davis, we'll just pass the microphone now.
I guess I'm a reductivist to the extent that I think that corporations are useful fictions, but that I do think they're useful. I mean, I think of the ordinary case where a judge sits in court, hears evidence, convicts somebody of theft, and sentences them to 30 days in prison. Okay, that's state action. If I, not being a judge, hear evidence from somebody and think, yeah, that person's guilty of theft, and I issue a warrant to a friend of mine, authorizing him to imprison that person for 30 days, and that person goes out and imprisons that person for 30 days, right? If there's no difference between state action and individual action, essentially there's no difference between a criminal justice system and vigilantism. So that's the difficulty I have of not insisting on that useful fiction of the state acting corporately, distinctly from individuals acting on behalf of the state with a warrant or under the commission of a judge or something like that.
Thanks. So I guess this kind of goes back to what I said to Danny, is that I think that there can be roles for institutions, right? So I think we can give an explanation in individualist terms, in terms of the rights and duties of individuals. So we might say something like, Helen has a right only to be subjected to fair punishment after a fair trial, right? And we've decided the best way to administer, to satisfy that moral right that I have as an individual is to set up this system of the criminal justice system. Right? So we have an individualist explanation of why we have this. The central thought for me is something like, so even though this looks prima facie like a case in which the state gets to do things because it's the state that individuals can't do, I don't think that's the right way to think about it. I think that the right way to think about it is that we can give an individualist explanation of why we've allocated certain roles to certain individuals to impose harms. But what makes the person who's subject to those harms liable is understood in terms of her individual rights and duties. So it's about what she's done that forfeited her rights against being harmed as an individual. And then if, say, there's somebody to whom she owes compensation, the state can make her pay that compensation. But that's just a way of mediating the various claims and rights of individuals.
Mr. in the red shirt at the end, if we can please pass the microphone.
Yes, hi. Thanks for coming and giving that truly thought-provoking presentation. I just have one sort of question concerning your example with the 50 leaves that had to be gathered, or the 100 leaves, 50 by each person. And sort of what would you say to the idea that by sort of gathering those leaves, this one person might be giving legitimacy to the unjustly gathered leaves, like that maybe he might have a moral obligation not to gather these leaves just because they might, even though it would give some good to the unjustly gathered leaves, that by giving some good to those unjustly gathered leaves, he's sort of like morally justifying that. And like, I'm not sure if this is an apt analogy, but for instance, say the scientific experiments that were done in Nazi Germany against the Jewish people, and the way that we do not use that scientific data because it would give legitimacy to those actions, even though they've already been done. So like, even if the person had already killed those people and gathered those leaves, by, you know, gathering those other 50 leaves, he's sort of saying that, you know, the person's actions will achieve their ultimate end.
Thanks so This is a really an interesting topic, and I do think it's kind of an apt comparison to make, because I think there's interesting questions about, and genuinely difficult questions about, what we should do with valuable medical knowledge which is gained through illegitimate means. So I see that there's this worry about, as you call it, legitimizing these actions, right? But on the other hand, if we've acquired knowledge that would save lots and lots of people's lives without now causing any further harms, then it seems to me like it's probably on balance impermissible not to use that knowledge. I think one of the worries we have is something like incentivizing. So that's probably going to be the best argument for why we shouldn't, is that we don't want people to do this kind of thing in the future. And perhaps if we make clear, like, look, if we ever find this stuff that this research that you're engaged in, we're just going to completely destroy it. Perhaps this might have some kind of deterrent effect and prevent people from doing it in the future. And if we thought that was the case, that might be a good reason not to use it, if we thought that on balance perhaps we'd save more lives or protect people's important rights better if we removed any possible incentive that people had, say, to engage in that kind of research. But if we set aside the sort of the deterrent aspect, I think on balance we probably should use the knowledge that's been gathered if it will now save people's lives at no further cost to anybody else. But I think it's a difficult issue, but I'd probably come down on that side. So in the Leaf case, I guess I'd want to say something similar, right? On the one hand, right, I don't think Brian should incentivize Christians or other people's wrongdoing, but if this is a case in which the wrongdoing's already occurred and now he just has an opportunity to save somebody's life that will not involve inflicting any unjustified harms, the moral legitimacy concern just gets outweighed by the saving of Alice's life, I think.
Okay, so I have two thoughts. And the first one, so what do you think about those people who say, well, there are actually different reasons for going to war and for acting within war? And one such difference may be that the decision to go to war, at least in the case of some wars, right, since you're ready to explore the concept a little, involves suddenly deploying troops, making it possible that a bunch of wrongs are going to be committed, especially if you accept that all wars are going to involve wrongs, right? Whereas when you're acting in self-defense, in an individual context within the war, it might be that it's simply not the case that these kinds of downstream wrongs are going to be committed, or that they need to feature in the context of your evaluation in the same way. I'm just wondering whether for you there's any difference there, or really is just one continuum. So that's the first thought. Yeah.
So I think it's just a continuum, right? So I've talked about these as what I call mediated harms. So I've talked about these in the context of self-defense as well. So I think that so we could imagine cases where if I defend myself against you, you're going to get so angry that you're going to go and kill two people, right? So you were trying to kill me, but I fend you off, but you get really mad, and so then you kill two other people. And then there's a question of, do I have to care about those harms I predict you'll inflict as a kind of, that I trigger by defending myself? Can they make my defense disproportionate? And I think that mediated harms count, but I think that they get discounted when harms arise through sort of intervening agency. So it matters that you'll be the one doing it, but I think they're not irrelevant to my defense. So say that what you want to do is pull my hair, right? And you shouldn't, it's wrong for you to pull my hair if I don't want you to. But I know that if I try and stop you, you're going to go and punch someone in the face, right? It seems like I should just let you pull my hair. It would be disproportionate for me to defend myself in a case where I foresee that the harms I then trigger involve someone getting punched in the face. So I think mediated harms matter. So I do think that this is kind of a continuum of that it matters in self-defense and ordinary life to think about how what would, say, otherwise be a justified action and a proportionate act of defense can be affected by the other harms I predict will arise as a consequence of my defense, yeah.
And the other thought, so you seem to say sides don't matter in war, right? So you want to dissolve this idea that wars involve sides. Is that the thought, that basically you should focus on individuals, on their individual sides? Size. Well, size might matter too. Size always matters, but so that sides don't matter, right? So you seem to be saying that we just get rid of this idea that you have individuals that are on the battlefield. Is there anything that can unify in a morally salient way some of these individuals? You seem to say at some point, well, Jonathan Parry talks about authority structure, that might do some work somewhere. Can authority, the way it's subdivided within the battlefield, have an impact? Or if not, is the cause just really something that might unify people on the battlefield? Because I'm always wondering, right? So you have different sides that are attacking an unjust side, let's say, and they do different things without coordinating with each other. Can one response to one of the sides be calibrated in function of the other side just because they have the same cause? Or,
What do you mean a response be calibrated because?
So you're thinking about a proportionality assessment, right? So how do you decide what is going to have to be proportionate to, right? So you have all these people attacking from all sorts of fronts. Whose actions are you looking at when evaluating what is going to be a proportionate response in a way?
So I think that there can be ways in which we can unify the sides by thinking about, but it's not things like being a member of this state's armed forces. It's more to do with things like the causal connections between you. So, for example, it might be true that I've helped facilitate your location, right? I may have brought you to a place. Maybe I drove the truck. Maybe I'm part of your unit. I've helped you to get to a place where now you're going to engage in some act of wrongdoing. Now, it could be that in some circumstances, I bear more responsibility, or I can be appropriately linked with your action in virtue of the things that I've done. Or I might incentivize your wrongdoing. I might facilitate it in various ways. Sort of the possibility of my actions might depend upon your having acted wrongly. Now, as a kind of contingent matter, it's going to be that because you and I are, say, trying to achieve the same just cause, our actions are just going to overlap and interact in these ways, like in ways that they won't with those who are trying to achieve a different cause, right? So those who are fighting on the other side. But those seem to me to be the morally interesting connections, right? It's not about being a member of a collective, a member of a group. It's about how my actions have facilitated or inspired or brought about the wrongdoings or the other actions of other people, right? And how far I've contributed to those. And I think that's the sort of the morally interesting way to think about how we kind of, if we wanted to think about a side. But then I still just want to say, well, what's the point of that, right? I still don't understand the point of saying, okay, now they're on that side, and I'm like, okay, so now what, right? Now we're going to evaluate them all together? Well, that just doesn't seem sensible to me any more than in the kind of the trolley cases where the bystander acts rightly and then the workman acts wrongly. I don't see the pull of kind of getting an all things considered judgment about the justness of those actions. As just one person act justly and one person acted unjustly. So I think the answer to your question is kind of yes. I think there's ways in which we can connect people in ways that are morally significant who are fighting on the same side for the same cause. But it's in these kinds of ways, not just as members of a particular collective.
Is this a question?
Yeah, I got it.
Yes, please. Microphone.
Hello. Thank you for your talk. I guess I just want to touch upon some of the ideas about the usefulness of saying that systems, institutions, states, larger collectives are morally responsible for particular actions, mostly because I'm kind of concerned about the reductivist account of aggravating individual actions, because I feel like one of the major concerns is that we can kind of scapegoat upon particular individuals, or that we can say that these are part of isolated incidents by a particularly bad leader or bad leadership or by people higher up in the hierarchy, when really we want to say that it's part of something that's wrong with the collective. So for example, one of the recent issues was one particularly bad CEO really increased the price of AIDS medications and things like that, and we really reprimanded him for doing that. And then we say, oh, that's just one isolated incident, that's just one person. But then there are other individuals who want to say that it's the larger pharmaceutical companies, the big pharma, that sort of thing, the institution that should have some form of moral responsibility for a lot of these underhanded actions. So similarly with like the state, we don't want to, I feel like we don't want to say, oh, it's just this one bad president making one bad decision. It's the state itself, the state actor, rather than the one individual. Yeah.
So what I don't want to do is say something like, so I'm worried. Sorry, I'm worried that there could be kind of ways of. So you're thinking about scapegoating, but I'm also think we need to be careful not to enable people to evade responsibility, right? So if you say something like, look, it's the system which is unjust, that's a kind of nice way in which we say, look, we kind of throw out no individuals to blame because the system is unjust. But that's just not true, right? Systems consist of individuals and the way that individuals act. So if we take, a collective like, say, the government, right? I agree, we don't just want to say something like, look, it's just a bad president or a bad prime minister, because there's people who voted for him, there's people who funded him, there's people who sit in his cabinet, right? So all of these people have roles to play. So I think I would have thought my view would be pretty amenable to this line of argument, that my view doesn't allow us to say something like, well, the US criminal justice system, it's just the system's racist, right? It's no individual, it's just the system is bad. Well, that's just not true, right? It's only racist because the individuals who run it and work within it are racist, right? They're the ones who act, they're the ones who impose unjust sentences. It's the jurors who are more likely to impose sentences on black people, right? So, there's just individuals who are racist and who act wrongly. And it seems to me it's much better to think about this in individual terms and criticize individual actions than to say something like it's the criminal justice system, because that's just a faceless thing, right? There is no individual who can be told to behave differently. So I just find the individual view just so much kind of better and intuitive at kind of attributing responsibility for wrongdoing.
Can I just follow up quickly then? So what about the consideration that when you really disaggregate the data, the particular moral responsibilities of individuals is almost nothing? Like similar to, say, climate change, where everyone does just a little, very small, almost insignificant part that causes this large change, such that when you really disaggregate the data or disaggregate the moral responsibility, there's almost nothing there for us to really reprimand each individual for.
So I think we need to distinguish between causal responsibility and moral responsibility. So it may be true that individuals only causally contribute a small amount, right? So in the case where we're all going to kick Francois to death, I just do one kick, right? But I'm clearly morally responsible if I get together with a group of people and decide to kick Francois to death. So we shouldn't make a mistake between the comparative smallness of a causal contribution to some wrongdoing and the extent to which I'm morally responsible. So it could be true that, for example, there are some harms to which everybody contributes just a small amount. But if we just said, look, when we think about our campaigns for environmental change, who could we possibly address other than individuals, right? Because we're the ones who do the polluting, right? So we're the people who have to be addressed. And it's true that lots of us need to change the way that we behave, but that doesn't mean that because lots of us have to change the way we behave, that sort of nobody's morally responsible for doing so. So again, I kind of think, well, what would be helpful or useful here by saying, well, it's just that humanity pollutes and humanity engages in environmental destruction, right? Well, no, there's individual people who engage in environmental destruction.
Any further questions? Professor Creel.
So I find myself, on the one hand, very sympathetic to your, there's no kind of bizarre entities. Ultimately, it's all humans, and I fully accept that. And yet, I do think that there are, that the question that I raised earlier, and I'm not sure exactly how, but that the fact that I believe in the fact that ultimately all the individual, that the responsibility of states is the responsibility of individuals, does not necessarily answer the question of the reducibility, if you want, of political philosophy to moral philosophy. And that perhaps, I'm not sure of that, there is a way of accommodating those two views. And I think it's the view that Philip Pettit tries to adopt. So on the one hand, he will be So in his book, The Common Mind, if I remember, he tries to exactly combine these two. And I know I'm kind of doing something unfair, kind of, throwing an argument of someone else, which I barely remember myself. But the point I'm trying to say is that, so here's the question, that it may be, one may consistently believe in what you just said, that, it's responsibility for global warming is not of humanity, it's of all of us humans. Humanity is the sum total of us humans, and yet may still consistently think that there's responsibility of corporate entities, and which is distinct from the responsibility of individuals, and or that political philosophy is not reducible to a moral philosophy. And here's a question in which I'm sure you have an answer, but I just would like to know it. So 9/11 happens in New York. Let's say I'm an American citizen living in Los Angeles. In many respects, I wasn't at all in physical danger. I was, in fact, people in Toronto, for example, were much closer physically to the events than people living in Los Angeles. And yet people felt, and perhaps rightly so, that this was an attack on them, even if they lived in Los Angeles. And if someone said, I now joined the army because I felt under attack, can they do this on your story, on your account? And if so, why? So I'm sure you have an answer, but I just would like to know.
Thanks, Denny. So on the first thought, about corporations, I mean, again, I guess I can only say what I've already said, which is, look, there is no corporation that decided to manufacture this product in a particularly polluting way. There is a person who designed the system, there's a person who bought the system, there's a person who buys the product, right? So these are just, again, we just disaggregate into people. There is no such thing as the corporation that made a decision, because corporations don't have mental states, so they can't make they can't intend things, they don't make decisions. In terms of, so the 9/11 thought, right? I mean, I'm not quite sure what you're asking me. I mean, are you asking me whether it's permissible for Los Angeles? Well, sure, right? Because on my view, sort of states are kind of irrelevant, right? So if we're granting lots of things, right? So let's grant that, for example, the US then had a just cause for the subsequent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, right? Would it be permissible for me to come to the aid of somebody engaged in justified defensive action? Sure.
Oh, so anyone. So also,
yeah, but I mean, what would be weird to me to think is that only you could and the Canadians couldn't, right? That somebody from Toronto who wanted to help defend Americans from an unjust attack, right? It's weird to think that they would somehow be prohibited from doing so. But my view just thinks that the states are not morally relevant in that way. Yeah.
Any further questions? Well, if not, please join me in thanking Professor Phil.
Thanks very much.